No, I'm not aware of anything funded to look at possible natural causes for warming. I haven't heard of a single proposal that has been funded to do that, which I think is, I mean, this is just, scientific malpractice as far as I'm concerned. Scientists in this field have allowed themselves to be dragged around by the nose by some influential politicians. That's what's happened.
Question up front.
What do you know about the changes in solar output on the weather? It was, I believe, August that we had no sunspots.
Right.
Does that have to do
Yeah, there's a few people out there that have a theory that sunspot activity indirectly controls temperatures, and I really don't, it's a lot of hand waving right now. It's possible. I won't say that it's impossible. I'll say that at this point I don't believe it, and I think there's lower hanging fruit in terms of just the climate system. We know what nonlinear dynamical systems do. They change all by themselves. They don't need a reason. So this is something that I work on stuff that I know is really going on. It's only a question of how much. That is really speculative, the whole solar thing. But there are some people that really believe it. But it's, again, even the IPCC report mentions the solar stuff, but probably because it gets so much press. And they say basically the same thing that I just said, that there really isn't enough evidence to support it as a strong theory of climate change. But who knows?
You had indicated, Dr. Spencer, that you had submitted 2 papers, one in 07 and one 08, that had been published, and then you just submitted a 3rd one. In the first 2 studies that you put out, has anybody successfully debunked any of your observations or your analysis from the papers you published?
No. There's one physicist who won't even give his real name on the internet, who published a series of 3 articles. You can find them out there. They're called Spencer's Folly. That's what he called them. Spencer's Folly, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. And a few people found these things on his blog. The guy clearly knows his physics. He talked about how all of my ideas were bunk, but as I put on my website this morning, I pointed out that he could have saved himself a lot of trouble if he would have realized that I wasn't talking about the case of constant forcing. In other words, like the extra CO2 we put into the atmosphere is a constant forcing, a constant imbalance. It's like putting the lid on the pot. It's a constant imbalance that will get relieved once the pot heats up enough. Well, there's a mathematical analytical solution for how that's going to happen if the forcing is constant. What I'm talking about is changing forcing, because the real climate system is never in balance. It's going between too much energy coming in, too much energy going out, back and forth, back and forth. That's what I'm studying. And anyway, this guy went on condescending, holier-than-thou attitude about how I didn't know anything, and his assumption was completely wrong about what I was talking about. To answer the question, that's the only thing I'm aware of that approached, trying to disprove what I've said. What I've found is, if all you get is silence from the scientific community, you've made a good point.
One follow-up question. When something is peer-reviewed, how many peers does it take to be peer-reviewed?
For a paper, a scientific paper, I think that editors wouldn't allow less than 2. I don't think you'd go with 1 for a peer review. And then for proposals, probably more than that, at least 3 peer reviewers. So yeah, it's not like hundreds of people. People don't have time to do that.
You talked about the various feedbacks relative to low clouds and hot clouds, and I'm struggling to understand why they're different.
Good question. All clouds have both a solar reflection effect. You experience that outside. If a cloud gets in the way, it's going to be a little cooler because the sun isn't as bright, right? So all clouds have a cooling effect, but all clouds also have a greenhouse effect. The clouds that have the biggest greenhouse effect, the biggest warming effects, are the high cirrus clouds. They trap a lot of infrared. And the way to see the proof of that is if you ever watch weather on TV and they show an infrared image and they show cirrus clouds, they're always very bright, which means they're very cold. What that means is they're in the way of the warm radiation trying to come up from the ground. They're trapping the warm infrared coming out and then emitting just a little bit of infrared at a really cold temperature. And that's the greenhouse effect. That's how it works. So it's a matter of how much effect the clouds have on both the solar and the infrared. Low clouds, the cooling effect due to solar reflection dominates. High, thin clouds, the greenhouse warming effect dominates. That's the difference.
Other questions?
The one part of the whole inconvenient truth stuff that I find most frightening is the idea of a massive ice dam collapsing and pouring in and stopping the circulating currents. They're supposedly carrying energy around the Earth. So, have you done any research to see if the whole convection currents in the ocean, if that theory actually holds any water?
That's the kind of stuff that oceanographers do. You probably remember the research that led up to the movie The Day After Tomorrow. That was based on the idea that the thermohaline circulation in the Atlantic could shut down, stop transporting heat up to the North Pole from the tropics, and that Europe would go into a mini ice age. Well, I guess New York City went into a sudden ice age or something. All totally bogus from a scientific standpoint, but the basic science was that this might happen, the shutdown. Well, the scientists that did that, they had gone out like twice and measured ocean currents where the Gulf Stream goes up into the North Atlantic. They had gone out 2 times, like 5 years apart or 10 years apart, and got different measurements of the flow rate. The earlier measurements, the Gulf Stream was pumping water up there a lot faster, and then they come 5 or 10 years later. I don't remember the exact numbers. This is like paraphrasing or something. They come back 5 or 10 years later. Oh, the Gulf Stream has really slowed down. Oh man, if this continues, we're in big trouble. So they write the paper, and we get The Day After Tomorrow, which I thought had really cool special effects. So from that standpoint, it was good, even though the story in this movie was lousy. But then later they go back, and make more measurements. Oh, flow rate's back up again. Guess what? Natural variability. Mother Nature causes things to change year after year all by herself. But scientists, and it's really true in NASA too, then we launch a satellite to measure something new, and we see what it measures in 1 year, and then the next year, and the third year, there's a trend starting. If this trend continues, I found a news report from the 1930s, back when the PDO, you heard that the Northwest Passage opened up, in 2007. It wasn't the first time, it's happened before. It happened the last time the PDO was in its positive phase, 39 and 40. It was unusually warm in the tropics, and just like lately, the Great Lakes were unusually low in water levels. I wish it was when I wish I was living up there now. That's where I lived, and we lived on the water, and I lived up there when the water was too high, but now it's low. But anyway, back in the 30s, there were these articles that came out, and newspaper editors wrote a little editorial saying, well, Mother Nature goes through changes all by herself. Remember, this is 1930s, okay? The Weather Service meteorologists say that, water levels are low, but there are cycles, and eventually the water levels will return to normal. Sort of a voice of reason. Like within a month, there was this science magazine that came out that sounded like it could have been from today, because the scientist says if the current trend continues of water decline in the Great Lakes, it is a mathematical certainty that the Niagara Falls will continue or will stop flowing in 50 years or something like it. It's, some alarmist thing that, okay, this is stuff that Mark Twain back in 1883 giggled about. Scientists haven't changed. He said science is a wonderful thing. One gets such wholesale returns of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact. And that is still true today.
It looks like that concludes our presentation, but in closing, I'd like to offer some final remarks, which are that this evening we've heard some very scientifically sound critiques of climate models and of people that claim to have the dominant role in determining the policy of our nation, and there's some huge implications on climate policies that are going to be affecting us. So that's why CFAC has undertaken to bring Dr. Spencer on a nationwide tour all across the country. And if you'd like to learn more about our efforts and about our organization, I have a packet of information on the table as you exit. Also, the James Madison Institute, which co-sponsored this, has some information on the table as well. So thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful evening.